So contractionary monetary policy, what is the Fed's goal or what is their concern? So when we see a contractionary policy pursued by the Federal Reserve Bank, which it has been, their concern or their goal is inflation. So their concern is that inflation is too high. And so the Fed has sort of an unwritten rule that they want to keep inflation at 2%. So inflation that goes above 2%, they're going to be concerned about that. So if the inflation rate hits 3, 3.5%, 4%, etc., the Fed's goal is going to be to decrease or reduce that inflation rate. So how does this work exactly? Well, really just in reverse of what we just talked about with expansionary policy. So how does it work? The Fed is going to decrease its target federal funds rate. It's going to do that by selling bonds to banks. So in the federal funds market, the quantity of reserves and the federal funds rate, supply is fixed by the Fed, and here is demand. So there's our initial target, and I want to increase the interest rate. I can do that by decreasing supply of reserves. How do I decrease supply of reserves? Well, I want to get reserves out of banks' hands, and so I have to give them something to do that. All right, so I'm going to give banks a treasury security, a bond, sell it to them, and they're going to give me reserves in exchange. So I decrease reserves, and that's going to increase the federal funds rate. So if you've noticed in my previous graphs where I've shown the federal funds target rate, and on those graphs there's these gray lines that denote recessions. And so in every recession, you notice the target rate is going down. It's consistent with expansionary policy. In between those recessions, we have expansions. You notice the target rate is always going up. And so one interpretation of that is that the Fed is concerned about inflation, and they're increasing the target rate with the hope of, if I increase R, is to increase the other longer-term interest rates in the economy. So really, I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to decrease consumption. I want you to buy fewer cars and houses and home improvements and decrease investment. And if I can do that, my hope is that I've slowed down the growth rate of the money supply. So there is an effect on labor demand, right? So this is going to decrease labor demand. But in some sense, that's really a consequence of the policy, less so an objective. So with expansionary, the goal or the objective was to increase labor demand. That was specifically the goal. Here, the goal isn't really to decrease labor demand, it's to decrease the growth rate of the money supply. So the key thing to remember is that my goal is to decrease the growth rate of the money supply. Right? As the economy starts to improve, and consumption's increasing, investment's increasing, banks are making loans, that's increasing deposits, increasing reserves throughout the banking system, right? So money is being created naturally as a result of an economic expansion. As we know, when the money supply grows faster than GDP, that results in inflation. And so the Fed's goal here is to slow that down. Let's decrease the growth rate of the money supply. And we can do that if we increase our target interest rate. So remember that from the quantity theory of money, when money supply grows faster than real GDP, that's how we get inflation. And so the goal here of the Fed is ultimately to undo that process by decreasing reserves, increasing the interest rate will decrease the growth rate of the money supply. Now, the consequence, the effect of that is going to be the opposite, right? If decreasing interest rates increases labor demand, then increasing interest rates is going to decrease labor demand. Now, you could, if you kind of, in a perfect scenario in the labor market here, what we would see is the following. So here's labor supply, and here's labor demand. And boy, if we were at that point, that would be perfect, right? Basically, everybody that wants to work in the population is working. And L1 is pretty much at the level of potential workers. So there really isn't anything. I can't get any more employment than we have right now, unless the size of potential workers grows, but that's out of our control. So what can happen in an expansion that we've talked about before, right, is that as labor demand starts to increase here, so this is an expansion. And as that happens, the wage rate is going to go up, and that's going to tend to cause prices to go up, and that will in turn result in inflation, right? So that kind of gives us a way to think through our labor market, how inflation might be working or what it might look like. So if we're in this scenario, the goal then of the Federal Reserve is really to undo that, right? Well, let's not let wages grow so quickly by decreasing labor demand. So if I kind of go, to red here, see if I can get this switched. The goal of the Fed then is to increase the interest rate and decrease that labor demand back to where it was before. Now, if we start at this point, the contractionary policy doesn't really have any effect on employment or output. It just decreases inflation, right? So in the expansion, we're not really increasing output. We're just increasing inflation. And so in this case, we're only going to reduce inflation, not employment. If we weren't exactly at that point and labor demand were to decrease, let's say from here to here, we can see that we will get a decrease in employment, and that will lead to some additional unemployment. That was kind of this Phillips curve idea, that if I want to have less inflation, I'm going to have to accept more unemployment. And so that's potentially the downside to contractionary monetary policy. Okay, so there's one more thing I'm going to go through here before I have a question that will have you kind of work through this monetary policy models. And what I'm going to do next, or talk about next, are some of the other options that the Federal Reserve can pursue outside of simply open market operations.